Some mistakes follow you, no matter how far you run. For 30 years, Torvald has lived with the weight of every weapon he forged, every young warrior who never came home. Now at 62, the old blacksmith thought his past was buried. Then a starving girl appears at his door with a battered shield, begging for food. When he sees his own maker's mark on the metal, his blood turns cold. This shield belonged to warriors from a raid that destroyed everything he loved. The same raid that took his family. Now this girl carries proof of that terrible day, and she doesn't even know it. As Torvald listens to her story, he realizes the war that shattered both their lives isn't over. What really happened on that bloody battlefield 30 years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord, like the memories that haunted Torvald's sleep. He stood at his cottage window, watching the sun struggle through the grey clouds, much as he struggled through each day. The view from his small home showed the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving village, broken stone foundations, collapsed roofs, and weeds growing through what used to be bustling streets. 30 years had passed since the great raid, but time had been a poor healer. The village of Hjalmafjord had never recovered. Where once 300 souls had lived, worked, and raised their children, now barely 30 remained. Most were elderly like himself, too stubborn or too broken to leave for the larger settlements down the coast. Torvald's cottage sat at the village's edge, deliberately isolated from even this small community. He had built it with his own hands after returning from the battlefield, needing distance from the survivors who still carried the scars he had helped create. Every stone in its walls, every beam in its roof had been placed with the same careful precision he once used to forge weapons. But where his metalwork had brought death, this humble dwelling brought only solitude. The cottage was sparse but comfortable. A single large room served as kitchen, workshop, and living space, with a small sleeping alcove tucked behind a wool curtain. Shelves lined the walls, holding not weapons, but simple tools, a few cooking pots, wooden bowls, leather-bound books that Astrid had loved to read aloud by the fire. In the corner sat his forge, cold now for months. He couldn't bear to light it. Torvald ran his weathered fingers along the stone mantel above his hearth, where a small, carved wooden horse sat, the last thing he had made for his son Eric before the boy died. Eric would have been 35 now, perhaps with children of his own. Instead, there was only this silent cottage and an old man's regrets. His daily routine had become a ritual of remembrance and penance. Each morning, he would tend his small garden behind the cottage, growing just enough vegetables to sustain himself. The physical work helped quiet his mind, though it never fully silenced the whispers of his conscience. After the garden, he would walk to the village center, not to socialize, but to maintain the memorial stone he had carved for the fallen. 57 names were etched into that granite, including Astrid and Eric. The villagers respected his solitude. They understood that some wounds never healed, that some guilt never faded. Occasionally, someone would leave bread or cheese on his doorstep, and he would reciprocate with vegetables from his garden. It was a careful dance of community that required no words, no uncomfortable conversations about the past. But the past lived in everything around him. The broken gate at the village entrance bore scorch marks from the fires that had consumed half the settlement. The old market square, now overgrown with wild grass, still showed patches where blood had stained the earth so deeply that nothing would grow there for years. And in his cottage, tucked away in a locked wooden chest, lay the tools of his former trade, hammers, tongs, and files that had shaped the very weapons used in that terrible battle. Torvald had been Hjalmafjord's master blacksmith, renowned throughout the region for his skill. Kings and jarls had commissioned weapons from his forge. His steel was said to hold its edge better than any other, his armor to turn aside the strongest blows. Young men would travel for days just to train under him, to learn the secrets of working iron and steel into instruments of war. He had been proud of his work then, Each sword that left his forge was a masterpiece, each spearhead perfectly balanced, each shield boss precisely shaped. He would stamp his maker's mark, a hammer crossed with a lightning bolt, into every piece, signing his name to weapons that would outlive their wielders. The irony was not lost on him that his greatest works had become instruments of his greatest sorrow. The very battalion that defended Hjalmafjord had carried his weapons, worn his armor, trusted their lives to his craftsmanship. And when the raiders came, his steel had proven inadequate against superior numbers and treacherous tactics. Astrid had understood his calling better than anyone. Where others saw only violence in his work, she saw artistry, dedication, the preservation of their way of life. She would often sit beside his forge in the evenings, mending clothes while he worked late into the night. Her presence had made the hot, cramped workshop feel like the most peaceful place in the world. "You give them more than weapons," she used to say, watching him carefully adjust the tempering on a sword blade. "You give them confidence." When a warrior trusts his steel, he fights with his full heart. Erik had inherited both his father's eye for metalwork and his mother's understanding of its deeper purpose. At 15, he could already forge a decent knife, and his questions about advanced techniques showed a mind ready to learn the master's secrets. Torvald had planned to formally begin his apprenticeship after his 16th birthday. That birthday never came. The raiders had struck on a feast day, when the village's defenses were relaxed and its people gathered in celebration. They came not as a raiding party seeking quick plunder, but as an army bent on complete destruction. Later, survivors would speak of their organization, their knowledge of the village's layout, their targeting of specific buildings and people. Torvald had been at the feast when the alarm horn sounded. He had run home to arm himself, finding Astrid and Erik already preparing for siege. His wife, calm as always, was packing supplies, while Erik stood guard with a practice sword, trying to look brave despite his pale face. "Stay with your mother," Torvald had commanded, buckling on the finest armor he had ever made. "I'll return when this is over." Those were the last words he spoke to his son. The battle had lasted 3 days. Torvald fought with the desperate fury of a man protecting everything he loved, his warhammer crushing shields and breaking spears. His armor turned aside countless blows. His weapons never failed him. But gradually, inexorably, the village's defenses crumbled. On the 2nd day, smoke began rising from the residential quarter. On the 3rd, the raiders broke through the final barricade and began their systematic slaughter. Torvald fought his way through burning streets toward his home, arriving to find only ashes and silence. He had found them in their sleeping alcove, where they had hidden when the cottage caught fire. Astrid's arms were wrapped around Erik, protecting him even in death. The smoke had taken them gently, a small mercy in that merciless time. The raiders had vanished as suddenly as they appeared, leaving behind a broken village and broken lives. Of the 300 residents, fewer than 60 survived, and many of those would die from wounds or despair in the months that followed. Torvald had burned his dead with his own hands, using wood from his forge to build their pyre. He had spoken the old words over their flames, commending their spirits to whatever lay beyond. Then he had walked into the wilderness and not returned for 2 years. When he finally came back to Hjalmafjord, it was not the same man who had left. The proud master blacksmith was gone, replaced by someone quieter, more thoughtful, burdened by questions that had no good answers. Why had he survived when better people died? What purpose did his skills serve if they couldn't protect what mattered most? He had built this cottage and begun his exile from the craft that had defined his life. Sometimes, late at night, he could still hear the ring of hammer on anvil, the hiss of hot metal in the quenching barrel, the satisfied grunt of a warrior testing a new blade's balance. But those sounds came only in dreams now. The forge in his cottage remained cold because he could not bear to heat it. Every time he considered taking up his tools again, he saw Erik's face, heard Astrid's voice, remembered the weight of their bodies as he carried them to their pyre. What right did he have to make more weapons when he had already made too many? Now standing at his window in the early morning light, Torvald watched the mist begin to lift from the fjord. Another day was beginning, another 24 hours to fill with simple tasks and quiet reflection. He would tend his garden, visit the memorial stone, perhaps read one of Astrid's books by the fire. It was a peaceful life, if not a happy one. He had made his peace with solitude, found a kind of stability in routine. The villagers had learned to let him be, and the outside world rarely intruded on his carefully constructed isolation, which made the sound of footsteps on his path all the more surprising. Torvald frowned, pressing closer to the window. Someone was approaching his cottage, someone moving slowly, carefully, as if each step required great effort. Through the morning mist, he could make out a slender figure wrapped in a tattered cloak. Stumbling slightly with exhaustion, as the figure drew closer, he could see it was a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, with the lean build of someone who had known too much hunger. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face marked by hardship and determination. In her arms she carried something large and round, a shield by the look of it, though badly damaged. She stopped at his door and raised a trembling hand to knock. When their eyes met through the window, Torvald saw something that made his breath catch, a desperate hope mixed with resigned despair. The look of someone making a final gamble with fate. He opened the door before she could knock. "By my shield." "Sir," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I haven't eaten in days." Torvald stared at the young woman standing on his threshold, her words echoing in the morning air like a plea from another lifetime. The shield in her arms was indeed battered, its wooden face scarred by countless battles, the iron rim dented and discolored with age. But even in its damaged state, he could see the craftsmanship that had gone into its making. "I don't buy weapons anymore," he said gently, though something about her desperation made him hesitate to close the door. "I'm sorry, but please." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "It's all I have left. My father carried it in the northern campaigns. It's good steel, strong wood. Someone must want it." She swayed slightly on her feet, and Torvald realized she was closer to collapse than she was letting on. Her cloak, which he had taken for traveler's gear, was actually a collection of rags sewn together. Her boots were worn through at the soles, and her hands trembled, not just from the shield's weight, but from weakness. "When did you last eat?" he asked. 3 days ago, maybe 4. She straightened with visible effort, trying to project strength she clearly didn't possess. "But the shield is worth more than a meal. It could feed me for weeks if you—" She stumbled, and Torvald stepped forward instinctively to steady her. As he did, the shield tilted in her arms, and he saw something that made his heart stop beating. There, stamped into the iron boss at the shield's center, was his own maker's mark, the hammer crossed with lightning that he had used to sign his work for 30 years. The mark was weathered but unmistakable, as familiar to him as his own face. "Where did you get this?" The words came out sharper than he intended, and the girl's eyes widened with alarm. "It was my father's," she said, taking a defensive step backward. "He died when I was small. My mother said he was a good man, a brave warrior. This shield is all I have of him." Torvald's mind raced. He had made thousands of shields over his career, but each one was unique, shaped for a specific warrior's needs. This particular design, the distinctive curve of the rim, the pattern of bronze inlays around the boss, brought back a specific memory: the Raven's Hollow Battalion. He had equipped them just before their deployment to the Northern Territories, 40 shields, identical to this one. They had been young men mostly, eager for glory and adventure. Their captain had been particular about the specifications, requesting lighter shields than usual to improve mobility in the rough terrain they expected to face. That battalion had marched north and never returned. "What was your father's name?" Torvald asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Bjorn Eriksson." She watched his face intently, searching for recognition. "He served under Captain Torvald Grimson in the northern campaigns." "Do you know of them?" Torvald knew them. He remembered Bjorn Eriksson, a tall, serious young man with calloused hands and intelligent eyes. He had been one of the few warriors who actually understood the technical aspects of what Torvald created, asking thoughtful questions about metal composition and tempering techniques. "I knew your father," Torvald said quietly. "He was a good man." Relief flooded the girl's face. "Then you understand why this shield is precious to me. But I'm starving, and the dead don't need remembrances." She was right, of course. Sentiment couldn't fill an empty stomach or shelter someone from the cold. But as Torvald looked at the shield, his shield, carried by a man he had respected, he felt something stirring that he hadn't experienced in years. "Not quite hope, but something close to it. What's your name?" he asked. "Freya Bjornsdottir. Come inside." "Freya, let's talk about this properly." He stepped aside to let her enter, and she moved past him with the careful steps of someone conserving their remaining strength. Inside his cottage, she seemed even smaller and more fragile, dwarfed by the simple furnishings that had been sized for a large man's needs. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the chair by his fire. "I'll make food." "I can pay," she said quickly. "The shield, keep your shield for now. We'll talk about it after you've eaten." As he moved around his small kitchen, preparing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat, Torvald found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. Now that she was in better light, he could see more of her story written in her appearance. The scars on her hands spoke of weapon work. She knew how to fight. The way she sat, maintaining clear sightlines to both the door and window, suggested someone accustomed to danger. But there was something else in her bearing, a kind of weary dignity that reminded him powerfully of her father. "You've been traveling long?" he asked, as he set a plate before her. Freya's eyes widened at the quantity of food, and for a moment she seemed too overwhelmed to speak. When she did respond, her voice was thick with emotion. "Most of my life. My village was raided when I was 7. My mother and I fled south, lived rough for 3 years before she died of fever. Since then, I've been on my own." She ate slowly, deliberately, with the careful control of someone who had learned not to waste food or make herself sick by eating too quickly after a long fast. Torvald watched her doing calculations in his head. If she was about 25 now and had been traveling for 18 years, which village? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Skarfjord. It was small, nothing special, but it was home. Torvald's blood went cold. Skarfjord had been one of 3 villages hit during the same campaign that destroyed Hjalmafjord. The raids had been coordinated, systematic, not random attacks, but part of a larger strategy that had wiped out dozens of communities across the region. "My father died in those raids too," he said carefully. "Different village, same war." Freya looked up from her food, studying his face with new interest. "Which village?" "Hjalmafjord." Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Hjalmafjord was supposed to be impregnable. Everyone said the blacksmith there was the finest in the north, that his weapons never failed. They failed that day. The words came out more bitter than Torvald had intended, and Freya set down her fork entirely. "You're him," she said. "It wasn't a question. You're the blacksmith. That's why you recognize my father's name, why you know this shield." "You made it," Torvald nodded slowly. "I made it. I made weapons for hundreds of good men who died in those raids, including your father." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of shared tragedy settling between them like a physical presence. Outside, the morning mist was finally beginning to clear, letting pale sunlight stream through the cottage's small windows. "Is that why you don't smith anymore?" Freya asked finally. "Because of what happened. I couldn't see the point. All those years perfecting my craft, all those weapons made with such care, and in the end they couldn't protect the people who mattered most." He gestured around the sparse cottage. "This is simpler, growing vegetables, maintaining stone monuments. Nothing I do here will hurt anyone." Freya finished her meal in thoughtful silence, then reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew a piece of torn fabric. It was dyed in the deep blue and silver that Torvald remembered from the Raven's Hollow Battalion's colors. "Though much faded now, my mother saved this from my father's gear," she said, smoothing the fabric on the table between them. She said it was important that someday I would understand why. I never did until now. Torvald recognized the banner fragment immediately. It was from the standard that Captain Torvald Grimson had carried into the northern territories. The last banner, the Raven's Hollow Battalion, had flown before disappearing into the wilderness. They never came back, he said quietly. 40 good men vanished without a trace. We sent search parties, but the northern territories are vast and dangerous. Eventually, we assumed they had all died. They did die, Freya said, but not in the territories. They were recalled just before the raids began, told they were needed for home defense. My father's last letter mentioned forced marches, strange orders, weapons being redistributed. Something cold crawled up Torvald's spine. Redistributed how? He didn't know. Only that their gear was being inspected and reassigned for optimal effectiveness. Those were his words. Torvald stared at the banner fragment, his mind working through implications he didn't want to face. If the battalion had been recalled before the raids, if their weapons had been redistributed, where exactly did your father die? He asked, defending Skarfjord. But he wasn't supposed to be there. His unit had been ordered to Ironhold, 2 days' march east. He disobeyed orders to return home when he heard about the attack. The pieces of a terrible puzzle were beginning to fit together in Torvald's mind. The systematic nature of the raids, the precise timing, the way the attackers had seemed to know each village's weaknesses. Freya, he said slowly, I think we need to talk about more than just your shield. The conversation that followed stretched well into the afternoon, fueled by bread and ale that Torvald had been saving for winter. As Freya's strength returned with food and rest, her story emerged in careful detail, 18 years of survival, observation, and questions that had never found answers. She spoke of the years immediately after Skarfjord's destruction, when she and her mother had lived like ghosts in the wilderness, avoiding the main roads and established settlements. Her mother, Ingrid, had been convinced that the raiders would return to finish what they started, that nowhere was truly safe. She taught me to fight with whatever I could find, Freya said, demonstrating how to hold a eating knife like a weapon. Said a woman traveling alone needed twice the skill and half the trust of any man. Torvald watched her movements with a professional eye. Ingrid had taught her well. Freya's stance was balanced, her grip firm but not rigid. But there was something else in her technique, a refinement that spoke of formal training. Who else taught you? He asked. Freya's hand stilled. A few people, soldiers mostly, men who had lost their units in the raids. They recognized my father's shield, felt they owed him something. She set down the knife and reached for the heavy iron pot that Torvald had used to cook their meal. As she lifted it to carry to the washing basin, he noticed how easily she handled the weight, how her movements suggested familiarity with much heavier implements. You've worked a forge before, he said. Some. A smith in Volgestead let me help for 3 months in exchange for food and shelter. I was 15 then, still growing into my strength. She began cleaning the pot with practiced efficiency. He said I had good hands for the work, but he couldn't afford a permanent apprentice. What did you make? Nails, mostly, horseshoes, simple things. She paused in her scrubbing. I always wanted to try making something important, something that would last. But he said that wasn't work for someone like me. Torvald felt a familiar stirring of indignation. He had heard similar words throughout his career, usually from masters too proud or too fearful to acknowledge that skill was not limited by birth or gender. Some of the finest smiths he had known were women, though they rarely received the recognition they deserved. Someone like you, he repeated. Meaning? A wanderer, someone without family or status. Freya's voice carried old hurt, but no self-pity. He wasn't wrong. What use is a masterwork sword to someone who might have to run at a moment's notice? She finished cleaning the pot and set it carefully on the shelf where Torvald kept his few cooking implements. Her movements were precise, respectful of another's space, in a way that spoke of long practice in temporary accommodations. Why do you keep moving? Torvald asked. 18 years is a long time to live without roots. Freya was quiet for a moment, staring out the window toward the remains of Hjalmafjord's market square. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful, measured. At first it was fear. My mother's fear, then my own. We moved because we had to, because staying anywhere too long felt dangerous. She turned back to face him. But later it became something else. A search, I suppose. Searching for what? Answers, justice, understanding. She gestured toward the shield that still leaned against his wall. My father was a good man who died defending his home. But why was he there alone? Where was his unit? Why did the raids happen at all? These were questions Torvald had asked himself countless times during his own dark years. The official reports had blamed the attacks on opportunistic raiders from across the sea, but the coordination and timing had never made sense for random piracy. You found evidence of something, he said. It wasn't a question, Freya nodded slowly. Pieces. Stories that don't quite fit together. Orders that contradict each other. Too many coincidences. She reached for her travel pack and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. I've been collecting things. Inside the cloth were documents, letters, fragments of orders, sketches of insignia and battle formations. Torvald recognized some of them immediately. The seal at the bottom of one parchment belonged to Earl Magnus Bloodaxe, the regional lord who had supposedly coordinated the defense against the raids. Where did you get these? He asked, handling the documents with careful reverence, here and there. Soldiers who felt guilty about surviving, widows who found papers in their husbands' effects, merchants who overheard conversations they shouldn't have. Freya watched his face as he read. Do you recognize any of it? Torvald studied a partial letter that discussed troop movements and supply allocations. The handwriting was educated, precise, the script of someone accustomed to giving orders that would be obeyed without question. This seal belongs to Earl Magnus, he said. He was supposed to be organizing our defenses during the raids. Read the date. Torvald looked more carefully and felt his stomach clench. The letter was dated 3 days before the first attack, but it discussed redeploying defenders away from the very villages that were subsequently destroyed. This could be forgery, he said, though even as he spoke the words, he didn't believe them. It could be. So could this one, and the dozen others I've found over the years? Freya's voice carried the weight of accumulated evidence. But taken together, they tell a story. As Torvald continued reading, that story became increasingly difficult to ignore. Orders redirecting troops from vulnerable positions. Supply lists that seemed designed to leave certain villages under-equipped. Communications that suggested foreknowledge of when and where attacks would occur. Why would Magnus orchestrate attacks on his own territory? Torvald asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. Land consolidation. Political control. Elimination of rivals. Freya had clearly thought about this extensively. The villages that were destroyed were all relatively independent, with their own customs and allegiances. The ones that survived were more directly under Magnus's authority. Torvald set down the letters and rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. If Freya was right, if Magnus had deliberately arranged the destruction of dozens of communities, my weapons, he said quietly, the arms I made for the defense forces, if Magnus controlled their distribution, he could have ensured they ended up in the hands of his allies rather than his targets. Freya completed the thought that Torvald couldn't bear to voice himself. The implications were staggering. Torvald had spent 30 years believing that his weapons had failed to protect the people he loved. But if those weapons had been deliberately kept away from Hjalmafjord's defenders, if his steel had been used against his own community, I need air, he said, standing abruptly and moving toward the door. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright. The peaceful fjord scene, too peaceful for the darkness of what they had been discussing. Torvald leaned against his cottage wall, breathing deeply and trying to process what he had learned. Freya followed him out, moving with the quiet consideration of someone accustomed to giving others space to think. I know it's hard to accept, she said after a few minutes. I've had years to piece it together. You're hearing it all at once. If you're right, Torvald said slowly, then we were never really defending our homes. We were just playing parts in Magnus's plan. Yes, and he's still out there. Still in power. Yes, Torvald looked at this young woman who had brought such devastating revelations to his door. She had spent most of her adult life seeking truth about events that had shaped both their lives, driven by a determination that he recognized and admired. "What do you intend to do with this knowledge?" he asked. Freya's expression hardened with resolve that made her look older than her years. Make him answer for what he did. The next morning brought a clarity that the previous day's revelations had lacked. Torvald woke to find Freya already up, tending his small fire and preparing a simple breakfast with ingredients she had found in his stores. She moved quietly, efficiently, clearly trying not to wake him, a consideration born of long practice in shared spaces. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Emerging from his sleeping alcove, "I wanted to." She handed him a cup of the bitter tea he preferred in the mornings. "You gave me more yesterday than I've received from anyone in years. Food, shelter, listening, it's the least I can do in return." As they ate, Torvald found himself studying his guest with new appreciation. The desperate woman who had appeared at his door was still there, but rest and nourishment had revealed other aspects of her character. She was observant, noting details about his cottage that suggested both practical intelligence and genuine interest in his way of life. "You built this place yourself," she said, running her hand along one of the wooden support beams. "The joints are perfect. Most people would have used iron brackets here, but you carved everything to fit together without metal." Old habit. When you work with forge fires every day, you learn to appreciate wood that hasn't been weakened by heat and hammer work. It's beautiful craftsmanship. My father would have admired it. The mention of Bjorn Eriksson brought both of them back to the previous day's discoveries, but the morning light made the dark implications seem less overwhelming. They were still terrible, still demanding of action, but no longer paralyzing. "I've been thinking about what you said," Torvald began. "About making Magnus answer for what he did." Freya's attention sharpened immediately. And I think you're right. But wanting justice and achieving it are different things. Magnus is one of the most powerful men in the region. He has armies, allies, wealth, and we have nothing," Freya finished. "I know. I've thought about this problem for years. What solutions have you considered?" She was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. When she spoke, her voice carried the measured tone of someone who had spent considerable time planning. "Direct confrontation is impossible. Even if we could reach him, even if we could prove what he did, who would believe us? Who would care?" She stood and began pacing the small space, energy building as she spoke. "But there might be another way." "Which is?" "Other survivors, other families destroyed by the raids. If we could gather them, show them what really happened, you'd have an army of your own," Torvald said, beginning to understand. "Not an army. A community. People who deserve to know the truth about why their loved ones died." It was an ambitious plan, but as Torvald considered it, he began to see its potential. The raids had scattered survivors across the region, but many would still be alive, still carrying their own unanswered questions and unresolved grief. "It would take time," he said. "Years, perhaps. I have time. The question is whether you do." Torvald looked around his cottage, at the simple life he had built for himself over 3 decades. It was peaceful, safe, uncomplicated. Taking action against Magnus would mean abandoning that safety, risking everything he had carefully constructed, but it would also mean, finally, confronting the guilt that had driven him into exile. "I need to show you something," he said. He led Freya to the small storage room behind his sleeping alcove, where he kept supplies and tools for maintaining his cottage. In the corner, wrapped in oiled leather and buried under sacks of grain, was a wooden chest that he hadn't opened in months. Inside the chest were the tools of his former trade, hammers of varying weights, tongs shaped for specific tasks, files and punches for detailed work. At the bottom, wrapped in silk that Astrid had embroidered with protective runes, lay a smaller wooden box. "What is it?" Freya asked, watching as he lifted the box with reverent care. "Eric's practice sword. I carved it for him when he turned 12. The weapon was beautiful in its simplicity, smooth ash wood, shaped with the perfect proportions of a real blade, weighted to help a young man develop proper technique. Torvald had spent weeks on it, carving protective symbols into the hilt and inlaying the crossguard with silver wire. He wanted to be a smith like his father, Torvald said, running his fingers along the wooden blade. But he also wanted to understand the weapons we made, to know how they felt in a warrior's hands. Freya accepted the practice sword when he offered it to her, testing its balance with the automatic movements of someone who understood such things. "It's perfectly weighted," she said with genuine admiration. He must have been proud to carry it for 3 years. Right up until Torvald's voice caught and he had to pause before continuing. "I found it in his hand when I discovered their bodies. He died trying to protect his mother with a wooden sword." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of old grief settling between them. But this time, the sadness felt different to Torvald. Less like a burden and more like fuel for something larger. "If we do this," he said finally, "if we try to gather the survivors and confront Magnus, we'll need more than evidence and righteous anger. What else? We'll need to be prepared for war. Magnus won't surrender power simply because we can prove his crimes. If he feels threatened, he'll strike back with everything he has." Freya nodded grimly. "I know. I've always known it might come to that. Then you'll need better training than what you've received from grateful soldiers and sympathetic smiths," Torvald returned. Eric soared to its silk wrapping and closed the chest. "If you're serious about this path, I'll teach you properly." "You'd do that?" "I'd do more than that." He stood and faced her directly, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "I'll help you find the other survivors. I'll help you gather evidence. And when the time comes to face Magnus, I'll stand beside you." The relief that flooded Freya's face was so profound that Torvald realized how alone she had felt in her quest for justice. For 18 years, she had carried this burden by herself, driven by questions that no one else seemed interested in asking. "Why?" she asked quietly. "You could stay here, live peacefully. This isn't your fight anymore. It was always my fight," Torvald replied. "I just didn't understand that until yesterday." Outside, the morning sun was climbing toward its zenith, burning away the last of the fjord mist and revealing the day in sharp detail. It felt symbolic somehow, this clearing of the air, this emergence of clarity from confusion. "Where do we start?" Freya asked. Torvald smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn in longer than he could remember. "With your education. If you're going to be my partner in this enterprise, you'll need to understand more than just how to swing a sword or forge a horseshoe." "What kind of education?" "The kind that will help us dismantle everything Magnus has built piece by piece." 3 weeks had passed since Freya's arrival, and the cottage that had been Torvald's solitary refuge had transformed into something resembling a war room. Maps covered his table, marked with locations of destroyed villages and survivor settlements. Documents lay sorted into careful piles, cross-referenced and annotated in Freya's precise script. The evidence of Magnus's crimes was growing more comprehensive with each passing day, but it was Freya herself who had undergone the most dramatic transformation. Under Torvald's tutelage, the desperate wanderer was becoming something formidable. Her mornings began before dawn with physical training, exercises designed to build the specific strength and endurance needed for prolonged combat. Her afternoons were spent learning to read military documents, understand tactical formations, and recognize the subtle signs of political maneuvering that had enabled Magnus's deception. "Read this one again," Torvald said, sliding a water-damaged scroll across the table toward her. "Tell me what you notice about the timing." Freya studied the document, a battalion roster from the northern campaigns, listing the names and assignments of warriors who had served under various captains. Her finger traced down the columns of text, pausing occasionally to check dates and cross-reference with other papers. "The Raven's Hollow Battalion was reassigned twice in the month before the raids," she said. "First moved north to the territories, then recalled for defensive positioning, but their final orders placed them in locations where no attacks occurred. And 3 other units received similar reassignments. All veterans, all well-equipped with your weapons, all moved away from the villages that were subsequently destroyed." She looked up from the scroll with growing understanding. He wasn't just preventing them from defending their homes. He was ensuring his best fighters weren't in position to interfere with his plans. Torvald nodded approvingly. Freya's analytical skills had improved dramatically over the weeks, her mind sharpening with practice and proper nourishment. But more than that, she was beginning to think like a strategist rather than a survivor, seeing patterns and connections that escaped casual observation. "There's something else," she continued, pulling another document from the pile. "The supply manifest lists weapons, distributed to the defensive auxiliary units. I've never heard of before. Let me see. The manifest was signed with Magnus's seal and dated just days before the first raid. It listed hundreds of weapons, swords, spears, shields, all bearing descriptions that matched Torvald's work exactly. But the receiving units had names he didn't recognize, and their supposed commanders were listed with titles that seemed oddly informal. These aren't real military units, Torvald realized. Look at the structure. No proper chain of command, no established garrison assignments. These are mercenary companies. Mercenaries armed with weapons stolen from legitimate defenders, Freya said grimly. Magnus didn't just arrange for the villages to be undefended. He equipped the attackers with the finest steel in the region. The implications made Torvald's stomach turn. His weapons, crafted with pride and intended to protect the innocent, had been deliberately placed in the hands of murderers and thieves. Every blade that had cut down a fleeing villager, every spear that had pierced a defender's heart, had carried his maker's mark. "We need to find survivors from these units," Freya said, beginning to pace, as she always did when her mind was working through complex problems. "Someone who can testify about how they received their weapons, what their orders actually were. That won't be easy. Mercenaries don't usually survive their employer's displeasure, and Magnus strikes me as someone who cleans up loose ends thoroughly. Then we look for the ones he missed. The ones who were smart enough to disappear before he could silence them." As if summoned by their conversation, a knock came at the cottage door. Both Torvald and Freya tensed. Visitors were rare, and given the nature of their recent investigations, any unexpected arrival felt potentially dangerous. Torvald opened the door to find Bjorn the Elder, one of Hjalmafjord's surviving residents and a man who had known Torvald since childhood. Bjorn's weathered face carried an expression of concern, mixed with curiosity. "Good evening, Torvald," the old man said, his eyes taking in the maps and documents visible through the doorway. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all. Please, come in." Bjorn entered slowly, his joints stiff with age but his mind still sharp. He had been a warrior in his youth, then a merchant, and finally a keeper of village history, someone who remembered stories that others had forgotten. "I've been hearing interesting rumors," Bjorn said, settling into the chair Torvald offered. "About your young guest, about questions being asked regarding the old days." Freya and Torvald exchanged glances. They had been discreet in their investigations, but in a community as small as what remained of Hjalmafjord, complete secrecy was impossible. "What kind of rumors?" Freya asked. "The kind that suggests someone is finally asking the questions the rest of us were too afraid to voice." Bjorn's voice carried decades of accumulated wisdom and carefully suppressed suspicion. Questions about why our defenses failed so completely, why our weapons never reached the people who needed them. "You suspected something was wrong," Torvald said. "I suspected many things. But suspicion without proof is just an old man's paranoia." Bjorn reached into his traveling cloak and withdrew a small leather pouch. "However, I have been saving certain items against the day when someone with the courage to seek truth might have use for them." He opened the pouch and extracted several pieces of parchment, each bearing official seals and signatures. At first glance, they appeared to be routine military correspondence, but as Torvald and Freya examined them more closely, their significance became apparent. "Orders contradicting the defensive positions we thought we were supposed to hold," Bjorn explained. Messages that arrived after our scouts had already reported enemy movements, but dated as if they had been sent days earlier. Documents that didn't make sense at the time, but which I kept because something about them felt wrong. One letter in particular caught Freya's attention. It was addressed to the captain of Hjalmafjord's garrison, ordering him to relocate his best fighters to a position 20 miles inland, supposedly to intercept raiders approaching from the north. But the date showed it had been written after the raids had already begun. "This is forgery," she said. "Or rather, it's a real order sent after the fact to create a false record." "Exactly," Bjorn confirmed. "Someone wanted it to appear that our defenders had been properly positioned, when in reality they had been deliberately scattered and confused by contradictory commands." "How many people know about these documents?" Torvald asked. "Just me until now. And I've only shared them because I recognize the look in your eyes. The same look my son had when he finally decided to stop accepting injustice and start fighting it. Bjorn's son had died in the raids, got down while trying to organize a final defensive stand at the village granary. Like so many others, he had been a good man who died believing he was protecting his home, never knowing that his sacrifice was part of someone else's calculated plan. "Will you help us?" Freya asked directly. The old man was quiet for a long moment, studying both of their faces with the careful assessment of someone who had lived through enough conflicts to recognize the difference between righteous anger and destructive vengeance. "That depends," he said finally, "on what kind of help you're seeking." "Justice," Torvald said simply. "Justice for everyone who died believing they were defending their homes. And you think you can achieve this justice?" "We think we have to try." Bjorn nodded slowly, reaching a decision that seemed to carry the weight of 30 years of accumulated grief and unanswered questions. "Then yes," he said. "I'll help you. And I know others who will as well. People who have been waiting for someone to finally speak the truth about what happened to us." The discovery of allies in their quest for justice brought both hope and new complications. Over the following days, Bjorn the Elder proved to be a bridge to a network of survivors that Torvald and Freya had never imagined existed. They arrived quietly, usually at dusk, carrying their own fragments of evidence and their own carefully guarded suspicions about the events that had shattered their lives. Magnus the Miller brought records of grain shipments that had been mysteriously redirected just before the raids, leaving defending villages without adequate supplies. Sigrid the Healer carried letters from her late husband, a scout who had reported seeing organized military formations moving through the forest, formations that official reports claimed never existed. One by one, the survivors of Magnus's conspiracy shared their pieces of the larger puzzle, but it was Freya who made the most disturbing discovery. She had been examining her father's personal effects more thoroughly, items she had carried for 18 years without fully understanding their significance. Hidden in the lining of an old leather pouch, she found a piece of metal that made Torvald's blood run cold. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, holding the fragment up to the firelight. "Sewn into my father's gear. My mother said he told her to keep it safe, that it was important but dangerous." Freya watched his face carefully. "You recognize it. The metal was a broken spearhead, snapped off just above the socket, where it would have attached to a wooden shaft. But despite the damage, Torvald could clearly see his maker's mark stamped into the steel, along with traces of something darker, blood, long since dried but still staining the metal with rust-brown patches. "I made this spear," he said quietly, "but not for your father's unit. Who did you make it for?" Torvald set the fragment down and moved to his collection of documents, searching through the supply manifests and equipment lists until he found what he was looking for. "Here," he said, pointing to an entry in Magnus's weapons distribution records. This spear was part of a batch delivered to the Earl's personal guard 2 months before the raids. The implications hung in the air between them like a physical presence. If a weapon made for Magnus's guards had ended up at the site of Freya's village's destruction, covered in blood, "My father took this from one of his killers," Freya said, her voice steady, despite the horror of what she was realizing. He broke it off during the fight and managed to save the evidence. Evidence that Magnus's own men participated directly in the attacks. It was the final piece they needed to prove, not just that Magnus had orchestrated the raids, but that he had personally ensured their success by deploying his most trusted warriors alongside the mercenary companies. The scope of his betrayal was even more comprehensive than they had imagined, but as their evidence grew stronger, so did the dangers of their investigation. 3 days after Freya's discovery, Bjorn the Elder arrived at the cottage with troubling news. "Strangers have been asking questions in the village," he reported, settling heavily into his usual chair. "Men with the look of soldiers, claiming to be conducting a census for tax purposes." "What kind of questions?" Torvald asked. "About inhabitants, about visitors, about anyone who might have documents or artifacts from the old days." Bjorn's weathered face showed genuine concern. "They were particularly interested in you, Torvald. Wanted to know about your guest, your activities, whether you'd been in contact with anyone from outside the region." Freya began pacing, her mind immediately jumping to tactical considerations. "How many men?" "4 that I saw, but there might have been others. They moved like a unit, coordinated and disciplined. Professional soldiers," Torvald concluded. "Not local tax collectors." The cottage fell silent as they contemplated what this meant. Magnus apparently had sources of information that extended even into the remote communities where survivors had sought refuge. Their investigation was no longer secret, which meant they were no longer safe. "We need to accelerate our plans," Freya said. "If Magnus knows we're gathering evidence, he'll move to eliminate us before we can present it." "Present it to whom?" Bjorn asked. "Even if we could prove everything beyond doubt, who has the authority to challenge an earl? Who would risk their position to bring justice to villages that officially don't matter anymore?" It was a sobering question that cut to the heart of their dilemma. Magnus's political position was nearly unassailable through conventional means. He controlled too much territory, commanded too many loyal followers, had too many connections to other powerful nobles. "There is one possibility," Torvald said slowly, an idea forming as he spoke. "The High King has been consolidating power, bringing regional lords under closer oversight. If we could reach his court, present our evidence directly—" "The High King's court is 3 weeks' travel north," Bjorn pointed out, "through territory that Magnus controls. We'd never make it alive. Then we don't go to the court," Freya said, her voice carrying the decisive tone that Torvald had learned to recognize as her most dangerous mood. "We bring the court to us. How? The feast of Odin's victory is next month. Magnus always hosts a grand celebration, invites nobles and dignitaries from across the region, including," she paused for emphasis, "representatives from the High King's court." Torvald began to understand where her thoughts were leading. "You want to confront him publicly during the feast. I want to present our evidence before witnesses who have the power to act on it. Force Magnus to answer for his crimes in front of the very people whose support he needs to maintain his position." It was audacious to the point of suicidal. Magnus would be surrounded by his guards, in his own stronghold, with every advantage on his side. But it was also the only opportunity they were likely to get to reach people with the authority to challenge his power. "There's another problem," Bjorn said, "getting into the feast. Magnus doesn't exactly send invitations to the families of people he's murdered." Freya smiled grimly. "Leave that to me. I've been thinking about this possibility for years." Over the next hour, she outlined a plan that was both brilliantly simple and terrifyingly complex. It relied on timing, deception, and the kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose. "It could work," Torvald admitted when she finished. "But if we're discovered before we can present the evidence, then we'll die," Freya said simply. "But we'll die trying to bring justice to the people we've lost. That's more than most of us have managed in 30 years, Bjorn nodded slowly. "There's honor in that. And if we succeed, We'll free every survivor from the burden of carrying these secrets alone." As they began planning in earnest, Torvald felt something he hadn't experienced since the day he had found Astrid and Eric's bodies, a sense of purpose that transcended his own grief and guilt. Win or lose, they would finally force the truth into the light. But first, they would need to prepare for war. The night before they were to depart for Magnus's stronghold, Freya made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about their enemy. She had been unable to sleep, her mind racing through the details of their plan, when she noticed something odd about one of the documents they had collected from various survivors. "Torvald," she called softly, not wanting to wake Bjorn, who was sleeping by the fire. "Come look at this." He emerged from his sleeping alcove to find her hunched over the table, studying a letter by candlelight with an expression of intense concentration. "What is it?" "This correspondence between Magnus and someone called the Northern Wolf. I've read it a dozen times, but tonight something caught my attention." She pointed to a particular passage. "Look at the phrasing here, the way certain words are emphasized." Torvald read the passage she indicated. It discussed troop movements and supply allocations in language that seemed straightforward enough. But as he studied it more carefully, he began to see what had captured Freya's attention. "The writing style," he said slowly. "It's different from Magnus's other correspondence. Not just different. Look at this signature mark." She produced another document from their collection, one of Magnus's official proclamations, and placed it beside the letter. "Compare the way he forms his letters, the spacing, the pressure of the pen. The differences were subtle but unmistakable once pointed out." The official document showed the careful, measured script of someone accustomed to formal writing. The letter to the Northern Wolf was more casual, more fluid, the handwriting of someone writing to an equal rather than issuing orders to a subordinate. "You think someone else wrote this?" Torvald asked. "I think someone else dictated it. Someone Magnus was taking orders from, not giving them to." The implications of this realization sent a chill through Torvald's bones. If Magnus had been acting on orders from a superior, then their entire understanding of the conspiracy was incomplete. "Who is powerful enough to command an earl?" he asked. "Someone with more than regional authority. Someone with connections to the High King's court." Or Freya's voice trailed off as another, more disturbing possibility occurred to her. Or someone within the High King's court itself. They stared at each other across the candle-lit table, both grappling with the ramifications of what they had discovered. If their enemy wasn't just Magnus, but someone with influence at the highest levels of the kingdom, then their plan to present evidence to the High King's representatives might be walking directly into a trap. "We need to know who the Northern Wolf is," Freya said. "How? We don't even know if that's a real name or just a code." Freya was quiet for a moment, thinking through possibilities. Then she reached for her travel pack and withdrew something Torvald had never seen before, a small golden arm ring, elaborately carved with runic inscriptions. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "From the body of the man who killed my mother." Her voice was steady, but Torvald could hear the old pain beneath the surface. "She died defending me when I was 10. I took this from her killer before I fled." The arm ring was clearly valuable, the kind of personal ornament worn by someone of high status. But more than that, it was distinctive. The runic carvings formed a pattern that Torvald recognized as belonging to a specific noble house. "These are the markings of Jarl Ragnar Ironwolf," he said, examining the inscriptions more closely. "He rules the northern territories, serves as one of the High King's most trusted advisors." "Ironwolf," Freya repeated. "Northern Wolf." The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Jarl Ragnar wasn't just Magnus's superior, he was one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, with direct access to the High King and influence over royal policy. If he had orchestrated the raids as part of some larger political scheme, then their evidence alone would never be enough to bring him down. "This changes everything," Torvald said. "We can't just expose Magnus anymore. We need to prove Ragnar's involvement, and that means getting closer to the real center of power. Freya's expression had hardened with new resolve. The Feast of Odin's victory isn't just a regional celebration. It's a gathering that draws nobles from across the kingdom, including Ragnar himself. You want to confront them both, together, in front of the entire northern nobility. I want to force them to face each other. If Ragnar has been using Magnus as his agent, then he'll either have to support him publicly or sacrifice him to protect himself. Either way, we learn something valuable. It was even more dangerous than their original plan, but Torvald had to admit it was also more likely to succeed. A public confrontation between co-conspirators might reveal truths that no amount of documentary evidence could establish. There's something else, Freya continued, reaching into her pack again. This time she withdrew a rolled parchment that looked different from the others they had collected. Newer, cleaner, with an official seal that Torvald didn't recognize. What is that? Orders I took from Magnus's soldiers yesterday when they were asking questions in the village. Torvald stared at her. You pickpocketed Magnus's men. One of them. The leader was careless with his document pouch. She unrolled the parchment carefully. I wanted to know what they were really looking for. The document was indeed a set of orders, but not the routine census instructions the soldiers had claimed to be following. Instead, it was a directive to locate and eliminate surviving witnesses to the consolidation campaigns, with specific instructions to ensure no evidence remains that could compromise the northern strategy. Consolidation campaigns, Torvald repeated. Not raids, campaigns. Planned, coordinated military operations designed to reshape the political landscape of the region. Freya's voice carried a mix of vindication and horror. This wasn't opportunistic violence. It was systematic conquest disguised as random attacks. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place as Torvald read further into the document. References to territorial reorganization and loyalty optimization painted a picture of a conspiracy that extended far beyond personal revenge or local politics. They're rebuilding the kingdom, he realized. Eliminating independent communities, consolidating power under loyal lords, creating a more centralized authority structure. And every village that refused to submit, every leader who maintained traditional independence, was targeted for destruction. The scope of what they had uncovered was staggering. Dozens of communities across the Northern Territories had been systematically eliminated, their populations scattered or killed, their lands redistributed to Magnus and other loyal nobles. All of it coordinated by Jarl Ragnar from his position within the High King's inner circle. The High King, Freya said quietly. Does he know? It was the question that would determine everything about their next move. If the High King was complicit in Ragnar's schemes, then seeking royal justice was pointless. But if he was ignorant of his advisor's treachery, we have to assume he doesn't know, Torvald said. It's the only assumption that gives us any hope of success. Then we proceed with the plan, but we modify our approach. Instead of just exposing Magnus, we force Ragnar to reveal himself. How? Freya smiled, and for a moment Torvald saw something in her expression that reminded him powerfully of her father, the same combination of intelligence and determination that had made Bjorn Eriksson such an effective warrior by giving him exactly what he thinks he wants, she said. A chance to eliminate the last witnesses to his crimes, publicly and permanently. As dawn approached and their departure time drew near, Torvald found himself marveling at the journey that had brought them to this point. 3 weeks ago, he had been a broken man hiding from his past. Now he was preparing to confront not just his personal demons, but a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of their society. Win or lose, they would finally know the truth. And perhaps, if they were very lucky and very clever, they might even survive to see justice done. But first, they had to survive the Feast of Odin's victory. The journey to Magnus's stronghold took 2 days through territory that grew increasingly hostile with each mile. They traveled in disguise, Torvald as an aging merchant, Freya as his daughter, and Bjorn as their hired guide. Their weapons were hidden beneath trade goods, their evidence sewn into the lining of seemingly innocent traveling packs. As they approached the fortress of Ironhold, where Magnus would host his grand feast, the signs of the Earl's power became impossible to ignore. Patrols of well-armed soldiers rode the roads at regular intervals. Watchtowers crowned every hill, their signal fires ready to carry messages across the territory in minutes. This was not just a nobleman's estate. It was the headquarters of a military operation. "He's been building an army," Bjorn observed as they made camp on their final night of travel. "Those aren't ceremonial guards. Those are soldiers preparing for war." "War against whom?" Torvald asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Anyone who stands in the way of his consolidation plans," Freya replied. She had been studying the fortress through a small spyglass, noting defensive positions and patrol patterns. "Look at the banners flying from the towers. Those aren't just Magnus's colors. I count at least 6 different noble houses represented. Other conspirators? Or other victims being lured into a trap?" The possibility that they weren't the only ones walking into danger added another layer of complexity to their mission. If other surviving leaders had been invited to the feast under false pretenses, then Ragnar and Magnus might be planning to eliminate multiple threats simultaneously. That night, as they made their final preparations, Torvald found himself drawn to the tools he had brought for their mission. Hidden among their merchant goods was his master hammer, the finest tool he had ever crafted. Forged from steel that had been folded dozens of times to achieve perfect balance and strength. "You're planning to use that," Freya observed, watching him test the hammer's weight, if necessary. "But I hope it won't come to that. What would Astrid think of what we're doing?" The question caught Torvald off guard. He had been so focused on the practical aspects of their mission that he hadn't considered how his late wife might view their quest for justice. "She always believed the truth was more important than safety," he said, after a moment's reflection. "She used to say that hiding from hard truths only gave them more power to hurt you. And Eric would have wanted to come with us. He had his mother's sense of justice and his father's stubbornness." Torvald smiled sadly. "He would have been proud to stand against the people who destroyed his home. Then we carry them with us tomorrow." The morning of the feast dawned grey and cold, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the landscape like a physical weight. They approached Ironhold as part of a steady stream of merchants, entertainers, and minor nobles arriving for the celebration. The fortress gates were heavily guarded, but the volume of traffic made detailed inspection impossible. Inside the walls, Ironhold revealed itself as more palace than fortress. Grand halls lined with tapestries and sculptures spoke of wealth accumulated through generations of careful politics and strategic alliances. But beneath the opulence, Torvald could see signs of recent militarization, weapon racks disguised as decorative displays, servants who moved with the discipline of trained soldiers, architectural modifications that enhanced defensive capabilities. They established themselves in the merchants' quarter, setting up a small stall, selling the metalwork and textiles that served as their cover. From this position, they could observe the comings and goings of the feast preparations while remaining inconspicuous among the dozens of other traders. As the day progressed, the guest list became clearer. Magnus arrived in ceremonial armor, flanked by his personal guard and accompanied by several lesser nobles who showed him obvious deference. But it was the arrival of Jarl Ragnar Ironwolf that confirmed their worst fears about the true nature of the gathering. Ragnar came not as a guest, but as a co-host, his banners flying alongside Magnus's own. He was a man in his 50s, powerfully built despite his age, with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. More telling still were the troops he brought, not ceremonial guards, but veteran warriors who positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the fortress. "This isn't a celebration," Freya whispered, as they watched Ragnar's men take up positions. "It's a council of war. Their observations were confirmed as evening approached, and the true purpose of the gathering became apparent. The feast was indeed a cover, but not for the elimination of witnesses. Instead, it was a gathering of conspirators planning the next phase of their consolidation campaign. From their position in the Great Hall, they had gained entry as hired entertainment. With Freya posing as a traveling storyteller, they could overhear fragments of conversation that revealed the scope of Ragnar's ambitions. "The southern territories are ready," one nobleman reported. "Local resistance has been eliminated, and the new governors are in place." "What about the eastern provinces?" Ragnar asked. "Some complications." "The old families still have significant support. We may need to arrange additional incidents to justify intervention." Torvald felt sick as he realized what additional incidents meant. More villages would be destroyed, more innocent people killed, all to provide justification for Ragnar's political takeover. But there was worse news to come. "The High King grows suspicious," Magnus reported during a lull in the festivities. "His latest messages suggest he's beginning to question the pattern of raids and unrest." "Then we accelerate our timeline," Ragnar replied calmly. "How long until we can move on the capital?" 2 months, perhaps 3. But we'll need to neutralize his remaining advisors first. The ones who still have his ear. Torvald and Freya exchanged horrified glances. They weren't just witnessing the aftermath of a regional conspiracy. They were observing the planning stages of a coup against the High King himself. "We have to warn someone," Freya whispered. "Who? Everyone with the authority to stop this is either dead, compromised, or about to be eliminated." It was then that Torvald noticed something that changed his understanding of their situation entirely. Among the servants moving through the hall, several wore small pins or medallions that he recognized, symbols of loyalty to the High King's household. They weren't just servants, they were agents. The High King already knew about the conspiracy, or at least suspected it enough to place watchers in Ragnar's inner circle, which meant their mission had just become infinitely more dangerous and potentially more effective. "Change of plans," Torvald murmured to Freya as she prepared for her performance. "When you tell your story, make sure those servants hear every word." Freya nodded, understanding. Her entertainment had always been planned as a way to present their evidence publicly, but now it would serve the additional purpose of confirming intelligence that the High King's agents were already gathering. As she took her place before the assembled nobles, Torvald found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 weeks ago, they had been seeking justice for past crimes. Now they were potentially preventing future ones on a scale that could reshape the entire kingdom. The stakes had never been higher, and their chances of survival had never been lower. But as Freya began her tale, ostensibly a traditional story of heroic warriors and noble sacrifices, but actually a carefully coded account of Ragnar and Magnus's crimes, Torvald felt a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced since the day he had first lit his forge as a young apprentice. They were finally doing what they had been meant to do all along, protecting the innocent by standing against those who would exploit their trust. Win or lose, they would face their enemies with honor. And perhaps, if they were very clever and very lucky, they might even live to see justice done. But first, they had to survive the next hour. Freya stepped into the center of the great hall with the confident grace of a seasoned performer, but Torvald could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand never strayed far from the hidden knife at her belt. The assembled nobles turned their attention to her with the casual interest of people accustomed to entertainment during their meals, unaware that they were about to hear their own crimes recounted in vivid detail. "My lords and ladies," Freya began, her voice carrying clearly through the vaulted chamber, "tonight I offer you a tale from the old days, a story of honor betrayed and justice long delayed." She started with traditional storytelling flourishes, weaving a narrative that seemed to be about ancient heroes and legendary battles. But as she continued, The details became increasingly specific, increasingly familiar to anyone who had lived through the recent raids that had reshaped the northern territories. In those days, she said, there lived a master craftsman whose steel was renowned throughout the land. Warriors would travel for weeks just to carry weapons made by his hand, for it was said that his blades never failed those who fought with pure hearts. Magnus, seated at the high table beside Ragnar, began paying closer attention. Something in Freya's tone had shifted from general storytelling to pointed commentary. But evil had taken root in the land, Freya continued, her voice growing stronger. A wolf in noble's clothing had begun to weave a web of treachery, turning the craftsman's own work against the innocent. Good men carried the finest steel into a battle, only to discover that their enemies had been armed with equally fine weapons, weapons forged by the same hands that had equipped the defenders. Torvald watched the faces at the head table carefully. Ragnar's expression remained neutral, but his eyes had sharpened with attention. Magnus was leaning forward slightly, his hand resting near his sword hilt. The wolf was clever, Freya said, beginning to pace as she spoke, her movements drawing the audience's eyes while allowing her to scan the room for reactions. He arranged for the strongest defenders to be called away just before attacks came. He ensured that weapons meant for protection found their way into the hands of murderers. And when villages burned and families died, he shed false tears while counting the lands that would now fall under his control. A murmur ran through the assembled guests. Some seemed confused by the story's direction, but others, particularly those who had lost holdings in the recent troubles, were beginning to look troubled. "Tell me, storyteller," Magnus called out, his voice carrying an edge of threat. "What proof exists that such treachery ever occurred? Stories are just words, after all." Freya smiled, and Torvald felt his heart race as he recognized the expression. It was the same look she had worn when revealing her evidence to him, the look of someone about to spring a carefully prepared trap. "Proof, my lord. Why, proof exists in abundance for those with eyes to see it." She reached into her pack and withdrew the broken spearhead that had belonged to Magnus's guard. "Proof like this weapon, taken from the body of a raider who destroyed my village. A weapon bearing the mark of the royal craftsman, but distributed to men who should never have carried it." The hall fell silent. Magnus's face had gone pale, while Ragnar's expression remained carefully controlled. "And this," Freya continued, producing the stolen military orders, "correspondence that shows the wolf's true nature, orders to eliminate, witnesses, to ensure that no evidence remains of what he calls consolidation campaigns." "Enough!" Magnus rose from his seat, his hand now openly gripping his sword. "You dare bring accusations against your betters based on forged documents and wild tales? I bring truth based on evidence gathered over 18 years of seeking justice for the innocent," Freya replied, her voice carrying over the noise of nobles pushing back from tables and reaching for their own weapons. It was then that Torvald noticed something that made his blood run cold. The servants he had identified as royal agents were no longer moving freely through the hall. Instead, they were being quietly surrounded by Ragnar's guards, their presence clearly no longer secret. Ragnar finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power. "An interesting performance, young woman, but I'm afraid it ends here." He gestured, and soldiers began moving in from the hall's entrances, blocking all exits. But these weren't the guards who had been patrolling earlier. These were different men, wearing a golden crown pin that Torvald recognized with shock. Magnus's stolen crown. The ceremonial crown that had been taken from the royal treasury, melted down and reforged into symbols of loyalty for Ragnar's most trusted agents. The very men who were supposed to be protecting the High King were actually working for his would-be usurper. "You see," Ragnar continued, standing slowly and drawing a magnificent sword that gleamed with the distinctive patterns of Torvald's finest work, "we have been aware of your little investigation for some time. In fact, we've been using you to identify other potential problems that need to be addressed." The trap was complete, and it was far more comprehensive than Torvald had imagined. They hadn't just walked into danger, they had been herded here as part of a larger plan to eliminate all remaining opposition to Ragnar's coup. But as the circle of armed men closed around them, Torvald caught sight of something that gave him hope. Hidden among the loyal guards were faces he recognized. Men from the surviving villages, warriors who had fought in the original raids, and lived to carry their own questions about what had really happened. The rebellion that Ragnar thought he had crushed was still alive, and it was right here in his stronghold. The recognition was mutual. As Ragnar's corrupt guards moved to surround them, several men among their ranks caught Torvald's eye and gave almost imperceptible nods. Eric Ironhand, whose family had died defending Thornwick. Olaf the Red, sole survivor of Greenvale's destruction. Men who had spent years planning for exactly this moment, a chance to face their family's killers with steel in their hands. The problem with conspiracies, Torvald said, stepping forward with his master hammer gleaming in the firelight, is that they create so many enemies. Eventually those enemies find each other. Kill them all, Ragnar commanded, but his voice carried less certainty than before. What happened next transformed the Great Hall into chaos. The surviving warriors among Ragnar's guards turned on their companions with brutal efficiency, while the nobles who had been genuinely invited to the feast found themselves caught between armed factions they didn't understand. Torvald's hammer sang through the air, crushing the skull of a guard who lunged at Freya before she could draw her blade. Beside him, she moved with deadly grace, the knife that had been hidden at her belt now finding its mark between the ribs of a man wearing the stolen crown pin. The pendant, she shouted over the clash of steel. Magnus wears the Blood Eagle pendant. If we can take it, we can prove the theft. Torvald saw what she meant. Around Magnus's neck hung a ceremonial pendant that had belonged to the High King's personal regalia. A golden eagle with wings spread, its eyes set with rubies that caught the firelight. It was proof of treason that even Ragnar's political connections couldn't explain away. But Magnus was no ceremonial lord. As Torvald fought his way across the hall, dodging falling nobles and stepping over the bodies of corrupt guards, he could see that the Earl was a veteran warrior in his own right. The sword he carried, one of Torvald's masterworks from years past, moved with practiced skill as he cut down anyone who approached. Bjorn, Torvald called to the elder who was fighting with a spear taken from a fallen guard. Clear the path to the doors. We need witnesses to escape. The old man nodded and began pushing toward the main entrance, rallying other survivors and legitimate guests who were caught in the melee. If any of them could reach the outside world with word of what was happening here, Ragnar's plans would be ruined, regardless of how this battle ended. Meanwhile, Ragnar himself had drawn his own weapon, a massive two-handed sword that seemed to drink in the firelight. This was clearly a man who had earned his power through strength as much as cunning, and he moved through the battle like a force of nature, cutting down friend and foe alike in his fury. Torvald of Hjalmafjord. He roared across the carnage. Face me, Smith. Face the man whose orders forged your destiny. The challenge couldn't be ignored. Torvald worked his way toward Ragnar, his hammer deflecting sword strokes and crushing bones with each swing. Around them the battle raged on, but gradually the combatants began to form a rough circle, recognizing that this was the contest that would determine everything. You destroyed my family, Torvald said, as they closed to striking distance. You turned my life's work into instruments of murder. I turned chaos into order, Ragnar replied, his massive sword whistling through the air in a strike that would have split Torvald in half if he hadn't rolled aside. The kingdom was weak, divided. I made it strong. You made it yours. The same thing. They fought with the desperate intensity of men who had nothing left to lose. Ragnar's sword had reach and weight, but Torvald's hammer was faster, and his years of smithing had given him strength that few could match. Around them, other battles continued, but gradually the tide was turning in favor of the survivors. It was Freya who created the opening that Torvald needed. While he kept Ragnar occupied, she fought her way to Magnus and engaged him in single combat. Her years of training showed in every movement as she ducked under his guard and drove her blade up through his ribs, piercing his heart. As Magnus fell, the blood eagle pendant rolled across the stone floor. Freya snatched it up and held it high where everyone could see. "Behold the proof of treason," she shouted. "The royal regalia stolen and worn by murderers." The sight of the pendant, recognizable to every noble in the hall, broke the last of Ragnar's support. His remaining guards began laying down their weapons rather than continue fighting for a lost cause. But Ragnar himself was not finished. With a roar of pure rage, he launched himself at Torvald in a final desperate assault. His sword came down with enough force to shatter stone, but Torvald was ready. The master hammer rose to meet the descending blade, and 30 years of accumulated guilt and fury went into the blow that followed. When the dust settled, Jarl Ragnar Ironwolf lay dead, and justice had finally found its way to the halls of power. The aftermath of the battle brought a strange quiet to the great hall. Survivors moved among the fallen, tending to the wounded and securing evidence that would be needed in the trials to come. The blood eagle pendant sat on the high table like an accusation made manifest, its golden surface stained with the blood of those who had died to protect its secrets. Within hours, riders had departed for the High King's court, carrying word of the conspiracy's exposure and Ragnar's death. The royal agents who had survived the battle, those who had remained truly loyal, took charge of securing the fortress and its documents. What they found in Ragnar's private chambers confirmed everything that Torvald and Freya had suspected, and more. Maps showing planned attacks on a dozen more villages, lists of nobles marked for elimination or recruitment, correspondence with foreign powers, suggesting that the conspiracy extended beyond the kingdom's borders. The scope of what had been prevented was staggering, but for Torvald, the most significant discovery was personal. Among Ragnar's papers was a letter dated just days after the raid on Hjalmafjord, a letter describing Astrid and Eric's deaths in casual, dismissive terms, as if they had been nothing more than obstacles to be cleared away. "At least now you know the truth," Freya said, finding him in Ragnar's study as he read the document for the third time. "Your family died because they stood in the way of a madman's ambitions, not because you failed to protect them. I know. It helps, though, not as much as I thought it would." Torvald set the letter aside and looked at his young companion. "What will you do now that it's over?" "Is it over?" The question hung between them as they considered the work that still lay ahead. Ragnar and Magnus were dead, but their network of supporters and corrupted officials would need to be identified and dealt with. The survivors of their crimes would need help rebuilding their lives. Most importantly, the kingdom would need to heal from the damage that had been done to its foundations. "The fighting is over," Torvald said. "The justice, that's going to take much longer." 3 months later, they stood together in the rebuilt market square of Hjalmafjord. The village was still small, still fragile, but it was alive again. Families had returned from exile. New settlers had arrived seeking a fresh start. And for the first time in 30 years, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the streets. Torvald's forge was burning again, but the work he did now was different from what had come before. Instead of weapons of war, he crafted tools for building, hammers and nails, hinges and locks, plowshares and sickles. When he did make swords, they were ceremonial pieces for the memorial ceremonies that honored the dead. Freya had chosen to stay, officially becoming his apprentice and unofficially the daughter he had lost so many years ago. Her talent for metalwork had proven remarkable, but more than that, she had brought purpose back to his life in ways he had never expected. "The messenger from the capital arrived this morning," she said, entering the forge with a letter bearing the High King's seal. "The trials are complete. The last of Ragnar's collaborators have been sentenced." Torvald accepted the letter, but didn't immediately open it. He had testified at several of the trials, helping to identify stolen weapons and corroborate the evidence of systematic conspiracy. It had been necessary work, but painful, each session forcing him to relive the darkest period of his life. "What does it say about the survivors' compensation?" he asked. "Read it yourself." The letter was brief, but comprehensive. Lands would be restored to their original owners or their heirs. The High King was establishing a fund to help rebuild destroyed communities. Most significantly, a new position was being created, Royal Advocate for the Wronged, with authority to investigate and prevent future abuses of power. "They want you to take the position," Freya said, having read the letter before him. "Me? I'm a blacksmith, not a court official. You're a man who spent 30 years carrying guilt that wasn't his to bear, then risked everything to bring justice to people who had been forgotten by everyone else. You're exactly what they need." Torvald considered the offer carefully. It would mean leaving Hjalmafjord again, traveling throughout the kingdom to investigate complaints and protect the vulnerable. It would mean trading the peace he had found for the uncertainty of constant struggle against injustice. But it would also mean ensuring that what had happened to his family, to Freya's family, to all the survivors, would never happen again. "What about the forge?" he asked. "What about your training?" Freya smiled and gestured to the corner where a new anvil sat, smaller than his own but perfectly proportioned for her build. Beside it lay a set of tools that she had been crafting over the past weeks, each one designed specifically for her hands and her techniques. "I think it's time for me to complete my apprenticeship elsewhere," she said. Under a different kind of master, she reached into her pack and withdrew a wooden object that made Torvald's breath catch. It was a family seal, carved from ash wood and inlaid with silver wire in patterns, that spoke of both their histories, the hammer and lightning of his maker's mark intertwined with the raven and shield that had been her father's symbol. "I made this for us," she said quietly. "For the family we've chosen to become." Torvald accepted the seal with hands that trembled slightly. It was beautiful work, but more than that, it was a promise, a symbol of the new life they had built from the ashes of their old pain. Outside the forge, the village continued its work of healing and growth. Children who had been born since the rebuilding ran through streets that their parents remembered as ruins. Farmers tended fields that had once been battlegrounds. Life had returned to places where death had reigned, and hope had replaced despair. "Yes," Torvald said finally, tucking the letter into his apron pocket. "I'll take the position. But first let's finish what we started here." Together, they returned to their work at the forge, the rhythm of their hammers ringing out across the fjord like a song of renewal, a promise that the future would be built by hands guided by justice, not greed, and that the innocent would never again be forgotten in the schemes of the powerful. The seal they would use to mark their new beginning sat on the workbench between them, waiting for the day when their shared mission would take them beyond these familiar hills to help others find their own paths to healing. Some mistakes, Torvald had learned, really could be forgiven. Some guilt really could be transformed into purpose. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the family you lost could be replaced by the family you chose.